the chapel through the years. The sisters were very proud of their chapel and delighted in showing it to visitors. It was a focal point of the community's worship and prayer, where they gathered for Mass, usually at 7 a.m, recitation for the office and for night prayer at 9 p.m. Sister Claire, a former student of St Mary's College and later a teacher at both St Mary's and Catholic College Bendigo, remembers that every August 24th, the chapel consecration would be celebrated and candles placed around the chapel. Keeping the candles lit was always a major task for Sister Patrick. Students were only permitted to enter the chapel for special occasions. The boarders attended Mass in the smaller chapel, wearing their veils from First Communion Day. However, on the first Friday evening of each month, they were allowed to sit in the choir gallery to celebrate Holy Hour. Other visits to the chapel occurred on the death of one of the sisters, when the boarders would all file past the open coffin. Retreats for girls in years 11 and 12 were held in the chapel, which involved 2 days of silence. The girls wore a mantilla, a shorter veil, and read religious works. A priest would come and provide talks on life issues. In recent years, a number of St Mary's College students have chosen the chapel for their weddings and christenings. Today, the chapel is a living part of the college. Religious education classes use it for prayer, reflections and liturgies.
Hello and welcome to the Mercy Chapel at Coolock at Catholic College Bendigo. My name is Darren McGregor, and as we film this, I'm completing my 10th and final year as principal of this beautiful college. We sit in one of the most remarkable buildings in Bendigo. The Sisters of Mercy arrived in Bendigo in 1876, and within 8 years, this beautiful chapel had been completed. Well, when I say completed, let's explain that in a bit more detail. In 1884, the final wall of the chapel, sat about 7 metres behind me. But after 50 years of dedicated service to Bendigo, they were rewarded or gifted with a beautiful altar which you can see behind me. So in 1927, Monsignor Rooney presented them with this amazing altar. It has 13 different types of marble and has been sourced from over 7 different countries. But obviously such a huge altar didn't fit in a beautiful tiny little chapel. And so they extended the chapel out and built an entire new sanctuary. So this beautiful altar has sat here since 1927. It's certainly a wonderful piece of history and tells many stories of celebrations of faith, both sad and happy. The sisters would gather in this chapel, and the boarders, as they were referred to, would actually gather on the side chapel to our left. And so, unlike many of the convents where the Sisters of Mercy operated, the main convent was for the sisters, and the boarders only accessed it from the side. So that in recent years, when past students have come back to look at the chapel, many of them, even though they were boarders here, would only once, maybe twice, have gathered in this actual space in the middle. When it was built, most of the furniture, most of the tiles came from Ireland, and the superior at the time, Sister Aloysius Martin, would often say that colonists can't build good furniture, and so she sourced the oak from Ireland. There's a twist in that story, of course, because later when they decided to add 4 more chairs at the back, then it was actually sourced from Tasmanian oak. And surprise, surprise, the colonists were able to build beautiful furniture. The artwork which surrounds the chapel is perhaps some of the most famous in Bendigo. The Italian artist Cavallaro, who had been out here to do the Stations of the Cross in the Sacred Heart Cathedral, was commissioned to do some of the paintings here. And the alfresco paintings on the walls were done by Cavallaro at the same time as his work on the cathedral. The Feast of the Assumption, or the recognition of the Assumption painting, Cavallaro to his death would say that it was the painting of which he was the most proud. Today, the chapel is used regularly by students, and part of that has been enabled through our refurbishment of the chapel in 2006. In a recognition of 130 years of the Sisters of Mercy being in Bendigo, we decided to refurbish the chapel. Before we started, this beautiful tessellated floor had lovely lime green carpet covering it. And if we looked to the ceiling, we would have seen beautiful sky blue wallpaper, which, by the way, was slowly starting to flake away. So in 2006, we decided to completely empty the chapel. Every piece of furniture was removed, the Stations of the Cross were removed, everything was removed and refurbished. We also obviously repainted the entire chapel, and the decision on the colours was made to try and bring out the colours of the tessellated tiles on the beautiful floor. Interesting that when we uncovered the tiles, there was hardly any damage at all. And so we have this beautiful chapel today, and it's been the scene for us in recent years of very sad times as we have gathered here to remember and pray for students that we have lost and teachers that we have lost. But it's also, almost on a daily basis, a place of celebration of our faith and our community of Catholic College Bendigo. When you have a close look at our chapel, there are some interesting, unusual pieces which I just wanted to try and explain to you. If you look at the floor in the chapel, you'll notice that at the entrance, on the left and right hand side, there are two areas that don't have tiles. Where I am at the moment is one of those. And history tells us that on one side of the chapel was the chair, if you like, for the Mother Superior. So the Mother Superior would sit at the back of the chapel, and while she would lead prayers, she would also be obviously watching the observance of the younger sisters to ensure that they were being reverent. So on the ground, rather than tiles, we notice that there are floorboards. When we refurbished the chapel in 2006, another thing that we changed was this boarding here actually came through only to here. And so underneath this was simply concrete. So what we did was we carefully extended the floor space, if you like, for praying. The other thing that's interesting in this spot here is if you look at these beautiful pieces of furniture. In the early days, times of reverence and prayer for the sisters wasn't meant to be a comfortable experience. And a couple of interesting things here that history tells us. The backs of them have a very rigid piece running through the back of the seat. And if you sit here and don't sit perfectly properly, it's actually quite a painful experience. So if you were to bend your back or relax, then you'd feel this rod into your back. The second thing that's interesting is that there's a kneeling pad, because for much of the time, the sisters would have been kneeling and facing the wall in prayer. Because even though they lived in community, most of their prayer back in those days was private and individual. And if we lift up their seat, you can actually see that there's a small ledge there for them to put their prayer books for when they were praying privately to the wall. The other thing that's on the other side, that whilst there's the floor here, which provided the place for the chair, whilst we haven't got any photos at all of it, the history books record that there was a spiral staircase on the other side going up to the choir loft. So a couple of little interesting things about our chapel. Bishop Martin Crane decided that he needed people to help him set up Catholic education. The parishioners had started the primary schools, but really, because there was no funding, to make sure that education could continue, the bishops needed religious orders to run their schools. So Bishop Martin Crane headed all the way to Ireland and actually spoke to Catherine Macaulay and asked for Sisters of Mercy to come out to Australia and to come out to Bendigo. And so they arrived here in 1876. The stained glass window which was put into the chapel here was presented by Bishop Martin Crane himself. And so this beautiful stained glass window in the chapel, which represents Jesus on the cross with Mary and the disciple whom Jesus loved, John, on the other side. And you'll notice if you look at the writing that it actually says that it was presented by the Most Reverend Bishop Martin Crane. When the chapel was rebuilt, if you like, to fit in the altar, they actually took the stained glass window out of the original wall piece by piece. And then when the wall was rebuilt, they reassembled the stained glass window in the back of the church. And I'm sure you'll agree it's a beautiful testament to Jesus and to the sisters and to Bishop Crane.